Oh, yeah. Don't worry, I have a remote control that tracks you and follows you. Yeah. That's right.
It's like,
Yeah. All right. I think we're just about there. Go ahead and take it away.
all right, we're ready. Okay. Do you want to lower the lights or are you all comfortable? Can you see it? All right, then we'll go. All right, so thanks for inviting me. I think this all happened maybe last year when I talked to Dean Proctor when I was just getting started. After we discussing some of the fun work I did in Hawaii, like, oh, tell our local community about Hawaiian research. I said, for sure, because I love to. So this will be an overview of entomology on the snow-capped mountains of Hawaii, literally on Hawaii Island, the big island of Hawaii. So who am I? First semester WCCC, teaching Bio 155. So some of my bio faculty friend or staff and faculty friends are here. I was previously at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, where I was assistant professor, and then at Cal U when they were Cal U, and then sadly resigned when they went to Penn West. However, I've been an assistant professor of applied entomology or invertebrate zoology for a while. When I was in Hawaii, I was also the manager of, manager of a research collection that got certified by the state of Hawaii. Hawaii is an interesting state. They have equal protections for biological and cultural resources, which actually gets into a lot of our kind of controversial parts of research that are done in Hawaii. And that's the list. Okay. It was the fourth largest insect collection. It still is. It's being managed by actually two of my students who are still there. When I got my undergrad in Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania. So I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, as some people go to college are in that boat. And luckily, I was a bit of a strong student in biology, and my professor at the time said, you know what, for you wayward students that don't know what they're going to do, you can be our lab demonstrator for a year and figure your life out. So that's really where I got into teaching and got into more research. So the other thing I do is I'm the consultant for entomology. If anyone has pest management questions, I do environmental impact statements. And also I contract with my friend Ryan. He was my 4-H ento instructor back in '96, I believe. So out here in Pittsburgh, I go around and show bugs to people. So I did bring some bugs if anybody wants to see them. I just got trained and launched, as he calls it, this summer. This is at Raccoon Creek State Park, and do a couple of school programs to see migrates. It's pretty fun to do. All right, to Hawaii. This was the view from the museum in Honolulu where I got my PhD. So out the window, we could see local school. This is the biomedical research building, and then the Ko'olau Mountains. A beautiful view of an otherwise very ugly campus where all the buildings were made during the 50s. It looks like communist blocks. But the reality is not the views. The reality is this. Working with students, working with trainees, working with other colleagues, and usually a cold cinder block building where there is lots of air conditioning, even in Hawaii, hopefully the AC works, and the temperature is kept at about 62 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% relative humidity. So nice and cool, which means everyone's wearing jackets as they're sorting insects and entering. I cannot do work without a huge amount of support. So these are all of my students, all of which have been on various thank yous for publications, also doing their own work as master's and PhD students. Heather, where is she? Is it previous one? She just emailed today of, hey, did you look at that manuscript I gave you last week? I said, no, I'm preparing my talk. So we're working on stuff still for funding and support. Always mention that, so I don't miss it at the end. This is where we get into some of our ethics. My funding as a PhD student, as well as the first 2 years of my research appointment and as a temporary faculty was funded by a state agency called the Office of Maunakea Management in Hawaii. So it's state funding from research dollars going back into research funding to obtain information about the entomology, the bugs at the summit of a mountain where there is other environmental impacts happening. I also got funding, it was about like $3,000 from the 30-meter telescope itself for one survey. And then, of course, when I was at the UH College of Agriculture, Forestry and Natural Resource Management, they supported a lot of the lab work just because I had a space. This is actually at Cal when I taught it to class. If you ever get to that campus, they actually have a pretty good collection for vertebrates and invertebrates. All right. Here in Pennsylvania, I am doing wetland restoration work, but that's the focus of this talk. So I'm still working with a few students and Dr. White at Cal. All right, this is my student, Jessica. She is now working with the federal government in Agricultural Research Service. She was one of my major field assistants when she was an employee at the Office of Maunakea Management, and then also a master's student later on. Luckily, it was a well-funded agency, and we got to have really cool forerunners to drive up the mountain. And we always drew pictures of our bugs as we were driving around, so everyone knew what we were doing. If you can see, a little bit of snow right there. These are the snow-capped mountains of Hawaii. And literally, they are snow-capped because just 2 days ago, it snowed. So this is the Center for Maunakea Stewardship. It's gone through quite a few regulatory and naming changes. It used to be the Office of Maunakea Management when I worked for them. Afterwards, it switched again, and now it's switching one more time, given the controversy in Hawaii. It's the same agency, but they have changed funding mechanisms many times. So bureaucracy, here we go. This was a picture just from 2 days ago. This is, wow. I believe, Pu'uhaukea. I have to check. Yeah, that's the backside of Pu'uhaukea, which is actually part of the natural area reserve of the state of Hawaii, not University of Hawaii. This is at the summit. This is the sub-millimeter arrays. It's a radio telescope, as well as the Subaru telescope run by the Japanese government, but has researchers and postdocs from around the world. This is actually the dwelling place of the goddess of snow. That's Pu'u, or cinder cone. Poliahu is the goddess of snow. So if you've heard of Pele, the goddess of fire and lava, this is her counterpart of snow. Have thought many times in history. All right, science, sorry everybody. So insects, yes, we're talking about entomology. This is going to be real quick. It's a hugely diverse group of animals. Yes, they are animals. As a lineage, they're basically land-dwelling crustaceans at this point in evolutionary knowledge. Class Insecta is the most diverse class of all animals. 15 million or so species, maybe up to 40 million. The lineage predates complex plants. So insects were on land before plants evolved. Stems and roots haven't been evolved yet when insects were crawling out of the muck. Most of insect diversity is related to the coevolution with plants. So if that's the age of insects in general, how old are the Hawaiian Islands? How do we get weird, awesome insects in Hawaii if the Hawaiian Islands, at least the main ones that exist now, are only 5 to perhaps even 500,000 years old? Very young geological structures that emerge out of the ocean as a hotspot of magma. Actual Hawaiian Island chain goes the whole way out to Kure Atoll, which used to be high islands. They sank, and now they're coral reefs and atolls. This happened right after I left. So this was 2020, I believe. This is one of my research sites. You can see it under lava. That's Mauna Loa. It erupted in 2020, just for a couple of weeks, but it did destroy one of my Mauna Loa research sites. And that just goes to show that, yes, the island is still growing. Here's the same view from Maunakea, a different mountain. I'll show you that on the map here in a second. This is one of my low elevation field sites. When I say low elevation, 10,000 feet. So 3 to 4 times the elevation as we are here in the Appalachian Mountains, or at least the Appalachian Plateau. In Hawaii, it's just weird. Insects that arrived to Hawaii had to get there by flying there, or by hitching a ride on a bird, something else that flew, or on a seed that flew, or a log that, or a coconut that came across the ocean. Because the lands were never attached to land masses, we in Hawaii only have a few groups of the diversity of arthropods and all things, plants and everything else, that is everywhere else. So only about half of the orders of insects made it to Hawaii before humans brought them. So it's a very weird disjunct group of animals. Only 400 times at the top end did an insect ever arrive to the Hawaiian Islands and then evolve. So only 400 times in 25 million years has an insect arrived, at least the ones that we currently know. Maybe they got to those other islands that sunk under the sea. Only about 5,500 described species of insects, which is not a lot, about 10,000, and then 4,000. So half to a quarter of all insects in Hawaii are all introduced. So whatever you see when you're down low is usually not native. That being said, many people know the Hawaiian Islands for fish and birds, but the reality is invertebrates, as well as snails, centipedes, worms, and insects make up almost all of the diversity on land. Fish and birds and mammals barely. So why are insects important? They do everything. They eat everything, everything eats them. They're just trophic mediators. Everything eats insects. Even a pollinating bird that drinks nectar will feed its babies insects to have them grow faster. So what does that look like? Really weird insects. Yes, these are all macro images of bugs. In kind of a layman's term, bug. Every creepy crawly, I'm fine with that. Here is a long-jawed tetragnathid spider. Here's an orb weaver. It's around Halloween. So if you ever see a web perfectly circular and has a spider right in the middle, that's this genus, Nysius. We have those around here. But in Hawaii, it doesn't have a web. And it's a camouflage ambush predator. It has evolved to a very different style of life, even though its relatives are pretty common everywhere else. If you've ever had a Drosophila fly, little red-eyed flies in your house or used them in labs, this is the only, I think, still known lineage that evolved in Hawaii and then went everywhere else. Usually Hawaii is a dead end for species that arrived and they don't get back to the mainland, but genus Drosophila is actually originally from Hawaii 20 million years ago as a lineage, and then did get everywhere else to where Drosophila went today. Other fun Hawaiian bugs. Here's a caterpillar. This is Eupathecia. It is not a caterpillar that eats plants. Here it is eating a Drosophila fly. They're ambush predators. One of the few caterpillars that is a predator. This is actually from Maunakea. This is a fail grandma fly. It's still an undescribed species. It is one of the only flies that has stripes that go the wrong way on the wing. It's just pretty. I wanted to show it to you. There have been 4 found in the history of ever. I found 3 of them. One of them was from 1952. And it's just in a museum. This is our problem where we run into all the time in Hawaii. This is a beautiful, amazing beetle from South Africa. It arrived, this is an agriculture inspection. It came to the museum. Many places that do or do not have predators of specific taxa like Hawaii often will lose these protective spines, just become more bland because they might not have the predators that we consume them. So when we see something like this in Hawaii that has spines or armature, it's our first clue that it's probably not Hawaiian because there's less fighting and less evolutionary time to develop some of those protections. Compared to North America, yeah, there's a heck of a lot more stuff around here. These are just some images of something neat that I found in my yard or at Cedar Creek. Hanging flies, these are like a reverse praying mantis. They hang with their front legs and then catch their food with their hind legs. Really common in lower understory. None of those are in Hawaii. They didn't make it that far. They're pretty large. They'd have to fly the big Pacific under their own power. All right, so here's more local groups. Hawaii, hey, we never had any ticks until we brought them. Toad bugs, here's a spider that mimics ant, and mimics spider. Some wetland species of rabid ground beetles, ambush bug, if you've ever seen those. amazing camouflage. All right, back to Hawaii. As I said, it's a very large island chain. The high islands right now emerged from the ocean when Nihoa, a very small island right here, was actually already shrunk and was no longer a wet rainforest. So the species that are in the Hawaiian Islands, by and large, are only about 5 million years old as their lineage, as Kauai grew out of the ocean as a very tall island. It had rainforests as it grew, whereas the next youngest island, Nihoa, didn't have a rainforest at the time that Kauai came out of the water. So we have this stop or a gap in the types of species that could jump to these new islands because it's a very dry, wind-swept island then. So the main Hawaiian Islands, what most people know of, got my PhD in Honolulu. I have been to every Hawaiian island as well as Nihoa, doing entomological research. People always ask, why did you go into entomology? It's like, for the money. Honestly, it's a little bit true. It's because I got to latch on to funded research projects at Oklahoma State, at Manoa. I mean, I got some of the funding myself, but largely because there are pests. Often you get a funded research assistantship and not have to pay for your degree. So that's really why I chose entomology. So I didn't have to get more debt. All right, the big island of Hawaii. Here's Maunakea, where we'll have most of our story, and Mauna Loa, the largest volcano on Earth, really large. It's only about 100 feet shorter than Maunakea, but Maunakea gets all of the press for being the tallest island in the Hawaiian Islands, as well as on Earth, if you measure it from the seafloor. So it's much taller than Mount Everest, if you go from the seafloor. All right, here's the summit of Mauna Kea. There is a road. There are telescopes because it is the best place on Earth. I've looked at the studies. I've talked to astronomers. It's above the temperature inversion. It's very clear. There's very little light pollution. It's an amazing place for surface-based astronomy. And there's lots of telescopes there. But they have also built roads and buildings where some creatures live. That's part of the controversy. So if you're curious about how big the Big Island of Hawaii is, this is my terrible mapping skills, but it's actually pretty accurate. There you go. The Big Island of Hawaii is about the size of the southwest quarter, or maybe fifth of Pennsylvania. So it's a very big area, 4 or 5 counties wide, if you think of the sizes of our local counties, but it's one county with one mayor and only 200,000 people. So it's very rural. People are like, why would you leave Hawaii to come here? I'm a mountain person. It's a rural place. I love it. The mountains, either there or here. Okay, so Mauna Kea, as a mountain, is owned, we'll call it owned, by a few different entities. It's a natural area reserve. It's also a forest reserve. And then the university leases the land from the state, which is up in 2033. All of that occurs up here above about 8,000 feet. Here's what it looks like when you fly by. This was me waving goodbye when I left. These cinder cones were post-shield volcano eruptions that are a little bit taller than the surrounding glacial till. It was glaciated actually 2 times. So 15,000 years ago and 200,000 years ago. And this gray area, I have other pictures. This is a much different habitat and substrate than the eruptions that occurred thereafter. So very different soil. Here's the complexity of the land management. Blue is archaeological find sites, so cultural resources. The native Hawaiian people have been in the Hawaiian Islands 1,800 years, maybe 500 years, depending on what cultural history you know. But these are absolutely revered sacred sites, and there are burials. State of Hawaii, remember, environmental and cultural protections are equal under state law. Right? Pretty new state, only the 50s. And that was one of the only states that has that management. It's an equal state management. So yellow are where facilities are and where we do our bug monitoring to see if there are biological resources as well as the cultural resources. we hike with the archaeologists who have to get out here. Typically, our biology field group are a little bit younger than the archaeologists. So it's actually really much safer for us to go with them. They can train us on archaeological conditions so we don't damage anything, and then we train them on native or non-native species. They're part of our monitoring. It's actually a really cool, tight way to do research in a very desolate place. The only road is here. This is 14,000 feet, and we have to hike here. That is 4 miles in a straight line, but it is not a straight line. So it's an 8-mile hike, 13,000 feet across rocks. So here's what the work looks like.
Hopefully it works. Who wants to press the play?
It might not work because I don't have a button.
Yeah.
Are you going to try to press it, T? Thank you. All right. So some of the environmental impact statement work was actually for the military. This was during Afghanistan wars. They were actually wanting to train for helicopter sites because it's very similar to Afghanistan. And most of the hiking will be for bugs.
11,000 feet to the top of an unnamed cinder cone, where a proposed helicopter landing site is. So, looking for wavy bugs. Got some traps.
All right, it's not exciting. Press the hard work. The next one's more exciting. One more, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, you might have to.
Oh, you might have to.
He might have to
out.
click once. Yeah, away from the thing.
There you go. All right, one more video. This is actually what it looks like on Maunakea doing our environmental management monitoring for hiking in the snow. Very often we could not see anything, have to navigate only by GPS. So you're going through very rigorous conditions and you cannot see where you're supposed to be going. This is actually Illinois, made from Nysius. It's just climbing 35-degree mountains on the snow and ice. And that's my friend Adam. He slid right down right after that and had to do it all again. He was a bit bigger than me. All right, click the next one. And now I don't need your services anymore, Z. Thank you very much. All right, so as you can see, it's an alpine stone desert. This is not the beaches of Hawaii. This is a glacial till between cinder cones that all emerged after glaciation at this point. Actually, some of them, some were before. You can actually see this gray area, brown area, where the glacier pushed these rock, it's like ground into dust up almost halfway up the cinder cone and changed the soil chemistry in those areas. This is a view of that glacial till, very different habitat than the brown rocks. If you've ever seen those Japanese sand gardens where you rake it, that's actually a volcanic natural condition due to the freezing and thawing cycle. So in volcanic islands in Japan, these natural rock striations form due to a biofilm, so fungus and bacteria growing deeper, and then it's being loosely sorted and freezing and thawing every time so that the bigger rocks get pushed up with frost heaves and create these natural striations. In fact, a big part of our job was to not make any trails that anyone, visitors or tourists, could see. As soon as you make a trail, other people will want to go. So we had to hide all of our activity. So we're being sneaky around the backs of cinder cones with permission. We got all of our fluorescent gear and all that stuff on, but we couldn't make trails where people would see it. So if we were hiking from a starting trail, we would actually carry rakes with us and rake out our field work. Yeah, that is slow work. There is a water source. This is Lake Waiau. It's one of the highest elevation alpine lakes in technically the United States. But this is right at about 13,000 feet. It's its own cinder cone that is impervious to water drainage, and it's kind of fed just from snow falling right in that area. It's really, really neat. This is also the cultural connection. It's called the pico, or the belly button, from the earth realm to the spirit realm. And people, Native Hawaiian practitioners, ring umbilical cords and actually do a birth ceremony and deposit umbilical cords as part of their Native Hawaiian traditions. So very sacred site. You cannot do any field work there because of human remains. It's just beautiful. You're above the cloud line, hiking through the snow. It's actually way better to hike on snow than it is on the rocks because you don't leave trails, and it's a more solid surface as long as you can get up. All right, controversy. So this is last year. Hawaii has had lots of laws go into effect during the time that I was doing the research. Before and after that has changed. But there's a new telescope that they're hoping to build. It's called the 30-meter telescope. So 30 meters, almost 100 feet tall. It's going to be a big mirror if it's ever built. It is controversial. It's going to be one of the largest buildings on the entire island if it gets built. And I've seen this before. It will, in theory, given all of the work that is already done, they were hoping to actually build it right up here, maybe even where the Keck telescopes are at the very top of the summit. But that was all kind of nixed due to the environmental and cultural resource planning back in 2002, I think. And they decided, given the work that I've done of where bugs live, to put it way out there on the glacial till rather than on the cinder cones, which are a much more rare habitat. 3 times since I was working on the mountain, there have been Native Hawaiian protests about building that telescope as well as other telescopes, and they've shut down the one road many times. Part of my role, I'm in State University, was to interact with everybody. And actually, I just brought my bugs up and talked to all of the cultural leaders. They all knew me. I mean, it's a very small community, and showed them what we were looking for and made sure that they knew my students and are very supportive of environmental education. So it never, I mean, yes, it did impact our field work, but we would always be able to get through roadblocks because the work was not building a telescope, really. We were just monitoring insects that might be around where telescopes are or might be built later on. This telescope right here, this is the Caltech sub-millimeter radio telescope. This is gone as of 4 months ago. This was the last thing I did before I left, was the environmental impact statement of removing a telescope. You have to go through the exact same process for removing something as building something. Because bring up invasive species because you've got a bulldozer with dirt on it, that is a bigger problem than even destroying some habitat if you change an ecosystem that way. This was the main access road. This was in 2019, right when I was flying here to Cal when I got this job. They shut the road down. My students were still getting up there. And it was a much bigger protest than in 2014 and 2015. So sadly, I didn't get to talk to everybody, but my crew, this is the side road to the back. They would go talk to everybody, drive through, go continue on their work. They did not get to meet Jason Momoa. All right, so what's our rich history of bugs on the mountain? A species described in 1980. Yeah, it seems like a long time ago, but technically I was 1 year old. So I did not know about that bug at the time. It was described in 83. The only other research done and published after the species description was a cooling study. This is my joke. You can hear all the rest of them. They're super cool. That is actually technically accurate because they checked to see if the vacuum bug, this little dude here, could actually go below freezing temperature and not freeze solid. And they can't. So Dumont Montgomery, he was actually a researcher out of Alaska, and Steve Montgomery, the guy who actually discovered that one fly, the one that had the stripes going the wrong way, that's Steve Montgomery. He's the one who found it. He's more mature than me at this point in time, a little bit older. But ultimately, he caught bugs and caterpillars and spiders, which I'll talk to you about shortly, and sent them to Alaska where they stuck them to thermocouplers and saw if they could freeze solid at low temperatures or if they had some kind of mechanism to stop ice from growing. Hence, they could super cool without freezing. And then they went to look for vacuum bugs again in 1998. Did not find them. Actually, they found 2. That was one of my PhD committee members, Dan Malhemus. And of course, anything in the state where you catch bugs has to be public record because they're equally protected. You have to get permits. And then environmental groups found that they only found 2, whereas in 1991, there were thousands that they could find easily. And it became a candidate endangered species. Candidate simply means there's not enough information to choose if it's endangered or not. You have to get more information. There are so many candidate endangered species because we just don't know if they're at risk or not. So that triggered a huge funding boon from the Bishop Museum, private contractors, and eventually me, the cheap guy, PhD student in 2005. And ultimately, it was nearly $5 million from 2000 up until 2019 when I left, from multiple funders, mostly from the state of Hawaii, to get a handle on whether or not this bug should be considered endangered or not, or what to do if it's not endangered. In 2011, so 6 years after I started my research, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife decided not to list it as an endangered species if the rules and protections stay as is. So if the state continues to monitor and manage it, then the feds don't have to take over. If the state screws up, then the feds have to step in. It's kind of what the Endangered Species Act does. You get a candidate endangered species agreement to protect it, and then you don't have to do the federal regulation type. And it actually makes the work a bit easier and faster as long as you're still being protected. So that's the current status quo. All right, so alpine ecosystems, back to the science of it and a little bit more about regulatory, but as I said, it's above the elevation limit for typical trade wind inversions. Clouds are lower than about 9,500, 10,000 feet in Hawaii, which means that it's very cold, very dry, and every couple 100,000 years, it's interrupted by glaciers. Not our biggest concern right now. So here's the trade wind inversion. This is actually Manoa, the erupted volcano a couple years ago. Again, cinder cones, those are those eruptions that occurred either after or during a glacial event. In fact, the native Hawaiians had an adze or axe quarry over here, whereas eruption occurred under the glaciers and cooled down that lava so fast that it became like granite. And that's one of the strongest stones as a stone-making people. They didn't have metal refineries, no metal. And those stones from this area were traded all throughout the Pacific, like 500 years to 1,000 years ago. It's amazing. So from a bug perspective, you've got rocks to live. If the air temperature is cold, the surface is cold. Just below the surface of those rocks, we'll call it the mid layer, those different colors of rocks, and it's a little bit warmer. Heats up, cools down at a slower rate than at the surface or deeper in the soil. Because all of these areas were eruptions, there is an ash layer of soil. Not a lot of biology there. It's not like decaying leaves. It is just rocks. And this ash layer is very soft, very dusty, but you have to be some kind of creature that can dig in there or roots that can put down enough space in that ash to get water and nutrients, what little there is. So this kind of defines the rock habitat from an alpine stone desert perspective. Okay, let's talk bugs. I mentioned this bug before, the vacuum bug. Get there in a minute. Most of the work I did was the vacuum bug, as well as wolf spiders and caterpillars. Those are the big 3 insects and literally the largest animals that evolved on this mountain. A wolf spider about the size of the palm of your hand. It's big dude. That's the top of the food chain. Back to supercooling. Freeze tolerance and supercooling are those biological mechanisms for plants and animals that need to be able to survive in this environment. The Hawaiian silver sword is a plant. It actually is beautiful, white hairs. It has one of those symmetries of plant growth that reflects sunlight down into the growing stem and actually heats itself up. so that it can continue to grow even in freezing temperatures as long as the sun is shining. The sun shines a lot because we're above the cloud plate, even if it's very cold. So here is, you might not know, but this is the biological input. Here's the food for everything that lives at the top of it. It's not the snow, it's the bugs that fly up and then can't survive and die in the snow. So all nutrient input is literally dead bugs and seeds that fall as aeolian or wind-swept debris. And one of the studies I did was quantifying per square meter of how much food falls each day to quantify the nutrient input, because spiders, caterpillars, and vacubugs, this is what they eat. They've got their refrigerator that freezes their food for them, and then as it thaws, it falls down into the rocks, and then the bugs are in there crawling around, eating all the food. So, might age myself here, but you ever see Price is Right, Plinko? All that food bounces down through the rocks, and the insects can be in there, catching it and eating it, but the snow typically kills it first. It's snowy, or just the cold temperatures every day, even if there's snow, it freezes almost every minute. Oh yeah, they are not super cool because they cannot survive this. How do you catch vacubugs and all of the other things? Again, laws. You cannot kill them, or at least you have to do as much as you possibly can to not kill them. We have pitfall traps baited with shrimp paste, Filipino delicacy if you've never had it. But it's in the stores in Hawaii, and it smells like rotting insects because it's rotting shrimp. It's fermented shrimp paste. This was our main trap technique. It was published from 1991 and 98 that it worked. And then we had a water wick down to a water reservoir, so the bugs wouldn't just dry themselves out by eating salty shrimp. And it smells like rotten food, so they would just fall right in, and then they can't climb up the plastic. If you keep those traps out for more than 3 days or so, the dust and dust storms etch the plastic, and static electricity sticks dust to it, and then they can climb out. So we had to check those traps every day. So let's hike 4 miles out, check the traps, make sure everything's alive, suck them up in an aspirator, count them, and then release them because we weren't allowed to bring them home. So that is some detail work that we did. This sitting and counting with what we call an aspirator, it's a bug sucker. Maybe it was only 2 bugs. The biggest trap we ever had was 953. Sat there for 3 hours, had to count each one and then release. All right, they're very small, the vacubug. The caterpillars that live there are quite a bit larger. Halloween time, you ever see the movie Tremors? Those caterpillars live in the ash layer of soil and crawl up from below and eat other insects. They are predator scavengers. The spiders are major predators. They'll eat everything. So this is actually a new species, Julienne Petillon. And Kaina, she's actually in Hawaii right now. She's actually a student at Berkeley, UC Berkeley. But they're describing the high elevation spider as a new species. If you've never described a species before, here it is. Ta-da! You look at their reproductive structures, you look at their patterns, and you look at their eyes. This is the male pedipalps, which look like boxing gloves on spiders. You can always tell male spiders it's like a box. That's actually how they transfer the sperm from their testes to the female just by carrying it around. Very weird creatures are spiders. There's even almost, it's called the big-eyed, little-eyed spider, cave-dwelling spiders that live in Hawaii that have reduced eyes and reduced pigments, and they only live in lava caves, and they're a different species as well. So they're looking at all of these. It's a really cool project. Got to go through caves and everything to find those. All right, and here's what it looks like in reality. If you've ever seen a Dixie cup, it will fill up the entire base of that. The first time I saw one, I thought it was a mouse scurrying through the mountain because it was so large. We also described these 2 species of Agrotis moths. This is my good friend and collaborator, Matt Medeiros. He was a moth specialist. I'm not a specialist in anything. So when I find these things, I have to find friends or make them so that people would help me to do this work. We found caterpillars, raised them in captivity, made sure we knew what they emerged as to describe them as new species. This is actually the flower of the silver sword, so that very large plant. It flowers once every 7 to 100 years and that dies. So if you're a bug that only eats that plant, that only has flowers every now and again, you're probably more at risk for being an endangered species than the plant itself. Because if you can't eat anything else, the plant has to be there and has to be flowering in order to survive. That fly I showed you earlier, the relatives of that live in the seeds as maggots. They're gall-forming flies, and some of their only host plants are these very rare, very large, endangered species of plants. And of course, I can touch them, so that's the closest I got. Take pictures of pods. So describing new species, just like the spider, genitalia, extract, raw the wing venation. This is my student Marlena Sheffo. She was, I stole her from the art program at the community college, and she became my technician and worked for me for 4 years doing illustrations and identifications. So if you look up that paper, it's one of those free ones. Go for it. The Agrotis of Maunakea. Now to our main creature. I might finish it. The baby bug. It is an oddball. No wings. It's a carnivorous scavenger. All of its relatives are seed bugs that eat plants. Is the only wingless or micropterous. Those are technically the flight wings. You can see there are no flight wings. And in fact, when I've done dissections, all of the flight muscles are gone, and they store their 4 to 10 eggs the whole way up into the thorax and put a lot of nutrients into those eggs. The seed feeding relatives lay 200 eggs, much, much smaller. These are scavengers, they're higher at the trophic level. They invest a lot of their energy into their young. They're also super cool. They can go down to negative 27 degrees Fahrenheit without freezing salt. Mostly due to desiccation and increased salt content, not antifreeze in their blood. All right, they're also buddies. They're gregarious feeders. They feed in family groups. Here's male and female during amplexus. The males hold on to the females, often until they die, as a way to mate guard and make sure that their genetics passes on to the next generation. Because when you have a rare insect and it's hard to find a mate, hold on for dear life, and then you die. But therefore, you're stuck, and she can no longer mate with anything else. She has to lay your eggs. These are the babies. These are all eating a fly. Here's a close-up view of the mouth parts. They are sucking bugs. These are true bugs. That's why I'm allowed to use the word bugs when I talk about bugs in the technical sense. These are like stink bugs, right? They have a long proboscis and they suck the juices out of their, in this case, prey. But all of their relatives are seed feeders. They're not much different from a proboscis sense of eating a seed by squirting out digestive enzymes and then sucking up the insides from a seed versus a flyhead. So they have the raw materials of the mouth parts to eat insects, and maybe they just picked up a flavor for it. In fact, we sequenced plant DNA from vacuum bugs, which are supposed to be predators, and they were positive for plant DNA in every sense from a wild perspective, probably because they're piercing in and finding the gut contents of other insects and actually eating their plant juices from their stomachs as part of their diet as well. Here's the back end of a cricket. So if you've ever seen a cricket, you can kind of think and see how small these vacuum bugs are. So what we did from 2007, when we were allowed, took 2 years to be allowed to bring them back into the lab, once we showed that we knew how to catch them, and we raised them in the laboratory, and I'll show you some pictures of their development. Because again, none of this was known, which is why they were a candidate endangered species. Didn't know how they grew. No one had ever seen an egg. Knew nothing about it other than they live in this very place. So why the attention? It's a really cool species, of course. It's going to get some attention, just like the caterpillar that eats flies or the spider that lives in a cave and doesn't have eyeballs. They're neat. However, it also goes head to head with a $3 billion project. If it was an endangered species, the chances that any environmental destruction could occur was basically none. That is still the case. If there is improper management of their habitat, I'm not there anymore, right? So if someone, they are still looking. It's Justin Ye, it's actually really cool. They are still monitoring the baby bug. But if this rare species is the rarest and you destroy some of it when building something, what do? How do you make that decision? Literally, why do you get attention? The state and fed say you have to get attention. So that's one of the ways you can get some attention. And of course, they are super cool. Laugh.
Laugh.
Okay, so you saw this. They are weird insects. Here's all their relatives. I traveled throughout the entire United States going to museums. Many of the Hawaiian species are not in state museums. The Bishop Museum, the University Collection. In fact, one of the most intact collection of Nysius is Kansas. It was one of the describers of the species, Peter Ashlock, was at Kansas, Kansas State, as well as LSU, Louisiana. They have some at Carnegie. Like, it's actually really cool to look at all of the vacuum-bug's relatives to see how they evolved. So some of the work was, ta-da, very small bugs. I have some up front. As we finish up, we can look at those. And I also got to travel, collect as many of the living species of 27 described species from Hawaii and grind them up in the lab and check out their DNA to see who's related to whom. And in fact, got to do one really cool thing from the far Hawaiian Islands, the non-main Hawaiian Islands, the actual atolls, because there were some species of Nysius described from that is Kure Atoll and Midway Atoll, but they're not Hawaiian. They're not part of the Hawaiian lineage. They are literally nestled within all of their relatives from Asia. And they're even described from Japan as a species from Japan, and they likely arrived too. But the entomologists at that time were not getting into Japan very often because of a big war, and were not able to discern if these species were Hawaiian or not, and they described them as Hawaiian, even though they're just invasive or introduced species from Japan. So, hey, Nysius frigatensis and Nysius fulawei are not Hawaiian species. We still have to do this, publish this to get those names removed so that they are correct. The main Hawaiian island Nysius are this group that all group out together, and the vacuum bug up here at the top has a bunch of relatives that have wings, that are seed feeders, and are not very weird. So the vacuum bug without wings as a predator evolved very recently, probably by something similar on Maui between 800,000 years ago, and then made it to the Big Island and subsequently lost their wings and changed further. So the genes we used are actually able to be dated, the mutation rates, to actually estimate the age that they diverge from closest relatives. Marlena, she illustrated 2 of our new species, which we're still getting described from that big genetics paper that we are still working on. And these are the closest relatives of the vacuum bug. As you can see, they have wings. They don't eat other insects. 2 cool things I got to do, which I will never do again, I hope. They were cool just because I can point them out to you, but I got to work with British Broadcasting Company twice, where they filmed the vacuum bug in my lab on campus. And because we're a public institution, you don't have to pay anything, right? So they got my summer time when I'm not doing anything else other than research, and I had the bugs there, and they caught bugs with me, filmed them. So if you want to watch it, I think it ran on Amazon Prime. It's Islands of Wonder, or the older one, which I like better, but didn't like working with that crew as much. It's actually the same photographer, 10 years apart, but they were different producers. But this one I like because it's narrated by Benedict Cumberbatch, Dr. Strange himself. But you can't get that on DVD. It's beautiful. I have the DVD at home if anyone wants to borrow. So this is the crew when we were filming. They got some amazing stuff, but all of the bugs that you see were on little food trays that were in my teaching lab at UHELO. It was pretty funny we had little air puffers to make it look like wind was blowing. So all those macro shots are just on that. We did find one bug when we were in the field. They could not get it. All right, so endangered species work. What we actually did for many years was catch bugs, put them in giant refrigerators at different temperatures with light cycles, and grew them and counted them so that we could quantify the size of the head to describe the different molting stages. They're called instars, or the stadia is the amount of time that they were hatching versus second instar versus third instar versus fourth instar as they were growing to be adults. And again, Marlena illustrated the life cycle. Accurate to size of the eyes. Can't measure them any other way because when they suck up bug juices, they get bigger or smaller. So you have to use the width of the eyes to estimate how big they are. And then she actually did a lot of work. We did a lot of outreach to the community, and we had coloring books and everything. So the work. Here's Heather and Jordan. I said, hey, Hawaii students, go hike a mountain. None of us had any winter coats except for me because I wasn't from Hawaii. So we just layered up and did hikes. This is right next to the road, so we didn't have to have the full gear. Sadly, we did not have this kind of refrigerator to raise our bugs in. We had solid doors. They really looked like refrigerators, but they had a light cycle. This is actually the endangered snail work. If you've ever seen that, there's an article, I think, NPR just last week, with David Sisko, who's raising all of the endangered species of native Hawaiian snails, some of which only exist literally in because they can't release them into the wild because there's no habitat. What we found in captivity is, back to physics, everybody, laws of thermodynamics. These bugs can only grow at temperatures, given our lab work, that is found for about 8 hours a day at the top of the mountain when it's sunny. Otherwise, there's not enough thermal energy for them to grow and develop. So we did that work. It's a pretty, yeah, they are super cool. They can actually super cool. But generally, if they hide down in the ash layer, they can hide from freezing temperatures because that ash layer never gets below as long as there's 8 inches of rocks. If there's not 8 inches of rocks because it's glaciated and it's been scoured and all you have left is dust or granite, then a bug cannot survive there every night. They're likely to die pretty often. All right, so we did temperature-dependent modeling. We want to get into the details, talk. We found that at different temperatures, males live longer than females, which is very typical. Males are pretty much expendable in almost all of animals. So as long as they can survive, as long as they possibly can to find a female, it's one of those adaptive strategies, especially in low nutrient input environments. Males can kind of just hold on. Females invest all of their nutrients into their young and next generation, and they kind of die more often. Females do it as long as they can make it. So what we did was have a model for how much reproduction occurs, given what we got in the lab from different temperatures, where we can then put this out into the field and estimate that the population, as long as there are some, doubles in a simulated temperature on the mountain every 15 days. So if the population doubles every 15 days, as long as there are bugs to lay eggs, as long as it's summer, they can actually, as a population, grow pretty fast. If they're ever very rare, then it might take a long time for the population to increase again for them to survive as an overall species. So this is where things started. Vacuum bugs were extraordinarily rare. They were hardly ever found. 2005 was when I started, so I didn't actually do field work until 2006, 2008. There were already field monitoring sites that were constantly being monitored every year, and we just kept looking in the same places. But bam, 2010, huge increase in observable populations in the areas where we looked. Same as 11, 12, 13, bam, drought. So 2014, we were actually there to witness a drought. That high elevation lake almost dried out completely, and the population of bugs dropped dramatically, at least fungul bugs. Common for insects to go through these cycles, given their environment they're growing in or the plants they're eating. This is what it looks like on a map. These are all of the sites that were visited every year, all throughout the summit. We also have a whole bunch way out here that are not on this map. But ultimately, we could show numbers of bugs in different areas through time. Where they want to build the 30-meter telescope is way out here, where we have not been finding any vacuum because that's the glacial till. So from an environmental vacuum perspective, they're not likely to kill lots of vacuum if they build out there. Of course, other creatures, plants. So year to year, you could have huge population flux. This is 2013 versus 2014, almost no vacuum found. And then the year after, a huge increase again. So as long as something survives, they can reproduce it. We did estimates of how many we think are on each mountain, given the amount of trap intensity we have, up to 5 billion individuals of vacuum bugs in a good year, as low as 200,000 in a bad year. We also, because we did the life history work, kept track of immatures and adults during the same time of the years. Depending on if it was snowy or cloudy or rainy, have different ratios of breeding adults and babies. Babies can't breed. They have to grow for a month in order to have that next generation. Some of the work we did because of this requires environmental monitoring to occur on the northeast sides of the mountains, where they're more likely to be found. That's because of the temperature input during different times of the year, because that's where the sun is. We're in the tropics. It warms up faster, and that's why we have more bugs there. Because of our temperature modeling work, we also found that in the north and south aspects of the cinder cones, the amount of thermal energy there is changes given the track of the sun. So you get very different growth possibilities in the summer versus late summer because of where the sun's tracking. Finally, we validated all of this with some modeling work with Ryan Perroy and Nathan Stevenson, where we put a random set of traps out on cinder cones. Here's the brown and the glacial till. Only found vacuum bugs in the brown area, not in the glacial area, whereas we found spiders and caterpillars in the brown area and modeled it out based on substrate and elevation. So this is another free paper if you want to look it up. Ryan Perroy, Nathan Stevenson. We put in all of our vacuum bug data, my data, Bishop Museum data, Greg Brenner's data as a private consultant, put it all together and did modeling from a GIS program perspective. It's a maximum entropy model, and found that the vacuum bugs, yes, they are more rare and more restricted to cinder cones than the spiders or the caterpillars. So if you're going to make conservation decisions, you should probably use the rarest things as an umbrella species to protect everything else. That is a standard conservation protocol. Use the rarest thing to protect things. It might not be as rare, and it's kind of an umbrella conservation perspective. All right, here we're finishing. So at the top, there are species that have been left high and dry. You don't even think about it, but in fact, the alpine environment is a very stable environment. It doesn't change much until we get climate change and all the other stuff that is not quite related to telescope building. But it's actually a predictable environment. And that's one of the reasons why many creatures lose flight potential in stable environments. So there's no reason to disperse. No reason, evolutionarily and physiologically, to go find a new plant if the plant is always there, or if the food you're eating is always falling out of the sky for you. There's no reason, no pressure to go and find anything else because it's always there for you. Almost everything up there is adapted to desiccation resistance. They're very hairy. You have freeze tolerance, supercooling abilities, or freeze avoidance due to microhabitat hiding rocks. And you have lots of general scavengers because the food input is not plants. It is just dead bugs. There are some insects that feed on lots of different plants and they can survive just on seeds and mosses and some grasses. And then the evolutionary stuff, which we didn't get too much. There's also a founding effect and genetic drifts that occur when you have an isolated population and huge booms and busts of population. So if there are any questions, 2 minutes over, please ask. This is my wife, Melissa. I just saw her in the back. She works right at the next building over. And so I want to thank Melissa and my dog Josie, even though she broke my finger. This one almost works. All right. Are there any questions anybody wants to ask? I'm an open book. Yes.
What do the ticks that you mentioned, the
Oh.
birds and man, what are the mammals that they're able to survive on? Like, do you have deer or what's there?
So in Hawaii, yes, there's introduced deer. They are axis deer. There's introduced sheep, goats. There's introduced mongoose. There's introduced dogs and cats and bunnies. There are plenty of mammals for dog ticks to actually eat. The only native mammals to Hawaii are monk seals and bats. So there are no real land mammals other than flighted bats, which have their own ectoparasites. It's pretty cool.
Do one more.
Yeah, go for it.
The lake that's on top. Now you say you're not allowed to study it because it's now is the water like really acidic or has it not ever been tested?
Yeah, so it has been tested.
Okay.
So there have been, and when we were there, like this was before Hawaii was a state or had those environmental protections. They did core samples. I worked with a permafrost guy, Norbert Scherpengrupper. He's an astrobiologist through the telescope. I literally met him on the bus because we were going to the same building because I was paid by the astronomy department as a research student, so I had to get my paycheck. And we just took the bus to the same place and we were chatting because he looks like me, glasses and nerdy. And he's like, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I study biology on Mars. Oh, I study biology on Maunakea. We should hang out. And so he does permafrost work and he's gone through and done ground penetrating radar to look at thermal and connectivity for ice versus water versus dryness on all those different rock substrates to actually see in a non-intrusive way that doesn't leave an impact what the undersurface of the area around the lake is. He never did the core samples, but they did the core samples back in the 60s, I think. And you can get a permit to do a water sample, but you have to go with cultural practitioners so you can ask permission and give thanks for what you're doing in the space. And that's one of the things we did as biologists every time we went up there. I had Hawaiians that knew the protocols and trained us in it. We would always do that. And literally everyone had the right to refuse to go up if it didn't feel right. Usually that was because you had altitude sickness and had to go back down. But if you get up there and the clouds are rolling in, it's likely to snow even though there's no snow in the forecast. Then you go back home, you didn't do your offerings right. It was just the reality of working in that sacred space. Any other questions?
What did you bring?
Bugs for show and tell. So I have a scorpion exoskeleton that I had out for Halloween trick or treat at my house. So it's just the exoskeleton. It glows green in UV light. So I brought that. I have giant hissing cockroaches to hold, play with, and then my Oklahoma entomology collection from my master's. It was easy to carry. I also have big displays from the consulting where I work with Ryan. They're all his displays. In the 90s, he was for all those permits. So he had permits, but they don't let you do it anymore. So he has amazing, large, showy moths and butterflies from all throughout Asia and South America, as well as Africa. So if you hire Ryan and I to actually do an education show, then you get to see the non-Oklahoma stuff. It's all because I had to sign non-disclosure and non-compete agreements. So I can't even show you that stuff for free. Now, anything else? Would you like to hold the stuff? No.
Stop.
All right. Are there any questions online? Everybody's done?
I think we're good.
Well, yeah, if anybody wants to hang out for a bit and look at some bugs.
Watch the thing.